Постои вистински момент за решение на спорот за името, вели во интервју за Сител амбасадорот на Холандија во земјава Волтер Пломп. Тој во разговорот со Славица Арсова зборува и за реформите кои предстојат пред македонската влада. Ево го интервјуто.
Mr. Ambassador, the European Commission published the strategy for enlargement with the Western Balkans last week. This document set strict criteria about what reforms countries should take to become members of the European Union, but also encourage them to take urgent reform action by 2025. Is there true willingness in the European Union for enlargement with the 6 countries from the Western Balkans, including Macedonia?
Certainly. No, thank you for that question. First of all, let me point out that in the past 10 years, the European Union, by the European Commission, has invested about 9 billion euros in the 6 candidate countries of the Western Balkans, exactly to get them perform according to the Copenhagen criteria. So if you ask me, are the Copenhagen criteria strict? Definitely they are. They are strict, they are specific, they are demanding, but there's also help. And there is considerable help, and exactly in the strategy that you mentioned, this Western Balkans enlargement strategy, it's very clearly pointed out that yes, the European Union wants the candidate countries to become members of the European Union, but also that there is considerable homework still to do.
Do you think Macedonia can undertake the necessary reforms in this time frame?
Well, to start answering that question, let's look at where Macedonia was a year ago. Because the strategy recognizes the significant steps that Macedonia has taken recently. And if you look at a year ago, then Macedonia was all the time in almost perpetual political crisis. I arrived 2.5 years ago to Macedonia, and I can hardly remember a different situation. And now what we see in the past year, that the discussion is now about reforms, about implementation of reforms, about a way forward. So I think that's already a very big step forward that Macedonia has taken.
The government set the 369 reform plan that should bring the country closer to the EU standards. How do you evaluate the implementation of these plans so far?
Well, a little bit in the same sense as the previous question. I mean, let's not forget, this government inherited a difficult situation, internally and externally. On the external front, the government has made, I would say, a real big step forward by improving the relations with the neighboring countries. I think that the step with Bulgaria is a truly historic step. On the internal front, some of the reforms are underway, but of course it's very important that accountability, responsible government, that will still further improve, and also that impunity will not be allowed in the future.
These are, in your opinion, the key steps that the government should undertake?
These are some of the general principles. If you ask me which specific steps, then I would say the public administration, the judiciary, and the intelligence or security sector. So what needs to be done? When you talk about the public administration, first and foremost, it should be clear that all appointments should be merit-based, should be on professional standards, and should not be on political party standards. I mean, a political party membership card should never be a reason to appoint someone. When it's from the judiciary, it should be clear the same professional standards, but also clearly some ethical standards need to apply. And some of the cooperation projects that we have undertaken, both as the European Union and as the Netherlands bilaterally, are exactly on these ethical standards for the judiciary, for prosecution, for everyone involved in the legal sector. And then when it comes to the intelligence, in fact that is where you could say it's the heart of the captured state that has been one of the reasons of the problems in the past years. And if you look at what was being revealed by the wiretaps, then I think one thing should be clear, that what has happened in the past should not be allowed to happen again.
Do you think that Macedonia will get a recommendation for starting the negotiations with the European Union? And when do you expect Macedonia to finally get the date for starting the negotiations?
I think on this one the enlargement strategy published last week was very clear. On the external side, there should be a real settlement of all the bilateral issues. And as I said, with Bulgaria, I think the government has made a real giant step forward with the agreement of the 1st of August. With Greece, of course, it needs to be done as well. Because if you look at the history of the European Union, you will see that it's very much based on the principle of reconciliation. In fact, the whole reason why the Western European countries started with the European Union or with the European Economic Community, as it was called at the time, was exactly the historic reconciliation between France and Germany. So it's obvious that the European Union does not want to import any bilateral disputes, so they will have to be settled before the negotiations can start.
Mm-hmm. Well, the negotiations between Macedonia and Greece have intensified in the past period. The Macedonian government is hoping to reach a solution in the following months in order to get the invitation for joining NATO on the next summit in July. How realistic is this in your opinion?
Well, first of all, let me make clear that NATO and the EU, they are sometimes used as if it's very different organizations. But let me say they're both communities of values, which means that both of them will look at indeed the settlement of the disputes with other countries, but also at the internal reforms. You will remember that in the Bucharest summit in 2008, the NATO communique was very explicit in the name issue needs to be settled and then there can follow an invitation. In the last couple of years, the NATO communiques made also clear that there was serious concern about the backsliding of some of the reforms, about state capture. So that also is a condition for NATO membership, just as it is for EU membership. Of course, there are differences, but the two organizations work very closely together, and definitely NATO will look at the country reports that the European Commission will produce in April, and vice versa, the European Union will look very closely at what NATO is doing. You also asked me about the name issue. I think there are some optimistic signs from both sides. At the same time, it's very clear that it is an extremely sensitive and a very difficult issue. So we will have to wait and see what will happen in the coming weeks or month. But let's not forget, I think there is a very momentum at this moment to start those negotiations with the European Union and later to get that invitation from NATO. So I think it's very important for Macedonia to grasp that momentum and to grasp this opportunity.
Do you think that in this final stage of negotiations there will be necessary to involve some experienced diplomats from the European Union countries or from the United States so that they can help to facilitate the final negotiations for the name?
Well, let's not forget, the negotiations take place under the auspices of the United Nations, and definitely Ambassador Nimitz is an extremely experienced diplomat. So I would say let's leave it in that framework. At the end of the day, it's very much up to the two countries to find a solution and to find a compromise. I mean, it's also obvious that neither of the two sides will have it completely their way. There will have to be found a compromise somewhere. And if you ask me, if you look at the minister on both sides, I happen to know Minister Dimitrov quite well because he used to be an ambassador in The Hague. And I can tell you frankly that my colleagues in The Hague told me that Mr. Dimitrov was one of the top diplomats in The Hague at that time. He was considerably punching above the weight of Macedonia, you could say. So I think if he cannot solve it, it's difficult to see who would be able to do it.
Mm-hmm. How is your country helping Macedonia in this process of joining the European Union and NATO, undertaking these necessary reforms?
Well, first of all, the Netherlands is of course a member state of the European Union. So also we work through the European Union. So if the European Union has invested something like 600 million in the past couple of years, that's also partly from the Netherlands. On top of that, we have our bilateral programs. I mentioned our cooperation with the judiciary, with the police, with prosecution. Those are usually bigger programs. At the same time, we have some very small grants, like I'm proud to say that the Mooi Vosdoeg app that I think most people in Macedonia have on their mobile phone was made by a Macedonian in the Netherlands, and we supported it just with a tiny little grant, and I think that also stimulates awareness of environmental issues. And next to, let's say, the cooperation, the technical assistance, there's also economic cooperation between companies. And if you ask me, that's maybe for the future the most important, because in the end it's companies who will create the jobs that are necessary to create a future for the people in Macedonia. And for instance, just to name two sectors, tourism, we have about 30 and maybe this year close to 40,000 tourists from the Netherlands coming to Macedonia, to Ohrid, but not only to Ohrid. That is something that creates jobs, but also textile. It may sound like an old-fashioned sector, but there's a lot going on. There are many new investments. And for instance, this shirt, I bought it in the Netherlands, but it's made in Macedonia. Interesting. And I visited the factory, and I can say that the people working there are quite happy working there. In fact, some of them were celebrating that they worked there 30 years. And in general, the Dutch companies or the foreign investment pay considerably above the minimum wage. So I think those are good jobs. And I'm very happy to stimulate, to encourage those kind of investments that will create jobs in Macedonia.
Ambassador, thank you for this interview for Sittel.
Thank you.